I should have known something was off when the attendant's eyes swept over my beat-up Honda Civic and lingered just a little too long on my faded jeans and worn sneakers. I should have recognized that particular look, the one that measures your worth by the car you drive and the clothes you wear. But honestly, after 15 years of being back in civilian life, I'd gotten comfortable with being invisible, with blending into the background like just another middle-aged woman running errands on a Saturday afternoon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gas station sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd Street in Riverside, one of those full-service places that somehow survived in a world of self-pump everything. My brother Miguel had mentioned it was his regular stop, said the owner was a good guy who kept fair prices and helped out folks in the neighborhood when times got tough. What he hadn't mentioned was that his good guy apparently had some staff who thought they could pick and choose their customers. I pulled up to pump number 3, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. The station had that timeless quality that reminded me of road trips from my childhood, when my father would pull into places just like this and I'd watch him chat with mechanics who had grease permanently embedded under their fingernails and stories that could stretch for hours. Back then, I was just Maria Santos, a skinny kid with pigtails who dreamed of flying helicopters and seeing the world beyond our small Texas town. The bell above the station door chimed as I walked inside, and I caught the scent of motor oil mixed with the artificial cherry of air freshener. Behind the counter stood a young man, maybe early 20s, with slicked back hair and the kind of smirk that suggested he thought he was considerably more important than his minimum wage job would indicate. A name tag read Brad in faded letters, and he was leaning against the register scrolling through his phone like my presence was an unwelcome interruption to his very important social media browsing. I waited a moment, expecting the basic courtesy of acknowledgement, but Brad continued his digital deep dive without so much of glancing up. The television mounted in the corner was playing some afternoon talk show, the volume just loud enough to create a constant buzz of background noise that filled the awkward silence. I cleared my throat gently, the way you do when you're trying to be polite but firm. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice level, "I need to fill up at pump 3. Brad's eyes flicked up from his phone with obvious irritation, like I'd personally ruined his day by having the audacity to want gasoline at a gas station. His gaze traveled from my face down to my clothes, taking in my simple white t-shirt, the jeans with a small paint stain on the knee from helping Miguel fix his fence last weekend, and the sneakers that had seen better days but were still perfectly functional. "We don't do charity here," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension that made my jaw tighten involuntarily. "You'll need to pay up front, cash only." I felt heat rise in my cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the familiar burn of indignation that came when someone made assumptions about who you were based on how you looked. It was a feeling I'd encountered before, though usually not quite so blatantly. I reached into my purse and pulled out my wallet, extracting 2 crisp $20 bills and placing them on the counter with deliberate precision. "That should cover it," I said, maintaining eye contact even as Brad's smirk faltered slightly. "Premium, please." He snatched the money with unnecessary force and punched buttons on the register like he was angry at the machine itself. "Pump 3, he muttered, not bothering to make change or offer a receipt, "and don't try to pump more than $40 worth." I wanted to tell him that I had a PhD in aerospace engineering, that I'd flown missions over 3 different continents, that I'd briefed generals and senators, and once shared coffee with a Secretary of Defense who asked for my opinion on military aircraft procurement. I wanted to explain that the paint on my jeans came from volunteer work, that my car was paid off because I believed in living below my means, and that my worn sneakers had climbed mountains on 4 different continents during leaves that took me as far from military bases as I could get. Instead, I just nodded and walked back outside, because some battles aren't worth fighting, and because I'd learned long ago that proving yourself to small-minded people was a waste of energy better spent on things that actually mattered. The gas pump clicked to life as I inserted the nozzle, and I leaned against my car watching the digital numbers climb steadily upward. The late afternoon air carried the scent of approaching rain, and I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd had with Miguel the night before. He'd called to check in, the way he always did on Friday evenings, and we'd talked about our parents, about his kids starting school next week, about the small rhythms of civilian life that I was still learning to appreciate even after all these years. "You know what I love about being back home?" I'd told him as I sat in my kitchen watching the sunset paint my walls gold. "Nobody cares about my rank or my security clearance or how many medals are gathering dust in my closet. I'm just Maria again." Miguel had laughed, the warm sound carrying clearly through the phone. "You were never just anything, Hermana, but I get what you mean." He was right, of course. I'd never been just anything, even as a kid growing up in a house when money was tight and dreams were expected to be practical. My father worked construction, my mother cleaned houses for wealthy families on the north side of town, and they both made sure their children understood that education and hard work were the only reliable paths to something better. When I announced at 16 that I wanted to join the military and become a pilot, they didn't laugh or tell me to be more realistic. They sat me down at our kitchen table and helped me research everything from ROTC programs to test requirements, treating my ambition with the same seriousness they brought to every important family decision. The pump clicked off at $38.73, and I carefully replaced the nozzle in its cradle, taking a moment to enjoy the simple satisfaction of a task completed. It was funny how the smallest things could bring you back to center, how the mundane act of filling your gas tank could remind you that most of life happened in these quiet moments between the drama and excitement that everyone else seemed to think was more important. That's when I heard voices from inside the station, raised just loud enough to carry through the open door. Brad was talking to someone, his tone animated in the way people get when they're sharing gossip they think is particularly juicy. "I'm telling you, man, you should have seen this lady who just came in," Brad was saying, his voice carrying that edge of cruel amusement that made my stomach clench. Dressed like she shops at Goodwill, driving some ancient Honda, trying to act all dignified when she wanted gas. Had to make her pay up front because you know these people, they'll try to pump and run if you let them. "What do you mean, these people?" another voice asked, and I recognized it as belonging to the older mechanic I'd seen working under the hood of a pickup truck when I'd first arrived. "You know," Brad continued, "the ones who think they're entitled to service when they clearly can't afford it, probably collecting welfare and food stamps, thinking the rest of us owe them something. My dad says that's what's wrong with this country, too many people with their hands out expecting everyone else to take care of them." I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest, the familiar sensation that came when ignorance and cruelty intersected in ways that made you question your faith in human decency. It wasn't the first time I'd encountered this kind of casual prejudice, and it wouldn't be the last, but it never stopped stinging. What made it worse was the certainty in Brad's voice, the assumption that everyone around him shared his narrow worldview and would nod along with his commentary. I could have gotten in my car and driven away. I could have added this to the long list of small indignities that accumulate over a lifetime and promised myself to never give this station my business again. I could have called Miguel and vented my frustration, let him reassure me that not everyone was like this kid, that most people were decent if you gave them a chance. But something about the confidence in Brad's voice, the casual cruelty of his assumptions, made me pause with my hand on the car door handle. Maybe it was the memory of all the times I'd stayed silent in the face of ignorance, all the moments when I'd chosen the path of least resistance because it seemed easier than confrontation. Maybe it was thinking about the young women who might come to this station and face the same treatment, who might not have the benefit of knowing their own worth regardless of what some kid behind a counter thought about their appearance. Or maybe it was simply that after 43 years of life, including 28 years of military service, I was tired of letting people's small-mindedness go unchallenged when a simple correction might plant a seed of awareness that could grow into something better. I walked back into the station, the bell chiming again as I pushed through the door. Brad looked up from his conversation with the mechanic, his expression shifting to one of barely concealed annoyance, like a customer returning to his workspace was somehow a personal affront. "Something wrong with your gas?" he asked, his tone suggesting that if there was a problem, it was probably my fault. "No," I said, placing my hands flat on the counter in a gesture I'd learned conveyed calm authority without seeming threatening. "The gas is fine. I just wanted to clarify something I overheard." Brad's eyes narrowed slightly, and I could see him trying to calculate whether I'd heard his conversation and what that might mean for him. The mechanic, who'd introduced himself as Frank when I'd nodded hello earlier, looked uncomfortable, like he'd suddenly realized he was standing in the middle of something that had the potential to go very wrong very quickly. "I'm not sure what you think you heard," Brad said, puffing out his chest in the way young men do when they're trying to project confidence they don't actually feel. "But customers aren't supposed to eavesdrop on private conversations." I felt a smile tug at the corner of my mouth, not because the situation was funny, but because I recognized the bluster for what it was. I'd seen it countless times over the years, from new recruits trying to hide their nervousness during training exercises to junior officers. "You're absolutely right," I said, maintaining the same calm tone. "Private conversations should stay private. I apologize for overhearing, but since I was the subject of your discussion, I thought it might be helpful to provide some context." Frank shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Brad and me like he was watching a tennis match where he couldn't quite follow the ball. Brad's face was starting to flush red, either from anger or embarrassment, and I could see him struggling to maintain his earlier confidence. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier edge. "I was just talking to Frank about business stuff." "Business stuff?" I repeated thoughtfully. "Is that what you call making assumptions about customers based on their appearance? Because I have to say, that seems like a pretty risky business strategy." The color in Brad's face deepened, and for a moment I thought he might double down on his attitude, might let his pride push him into saying something even more foolish than what I'd already overheard. But something in my expression or my tone must have registered with him, because instead of escalating, he took a small step backward. "Look, lady, I don't know what your problem is," he said, but the fight was going out of his voice. "I was just doing my job, making sure payment was secure before authorizing the pump. That's standard procedure." "Standard procedure?" I said, nodding slowly. "And is it also standard procedure to speculate about customers' financial situation and government benefits while they're still on the premises?" Frank cleared his throat awkwardly. "Maybe I should get back to work on that transmission," he mumbled, clearly desperate to extract himself from what was becoming an increasingly uncomfortable situation. "Actually, Frank," I said, turning to include him in the conversation, "I'd like you to stay if you don't mind. Since you were part of the conversation, I think you should hear this too." Frank's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded and remained where he was, wiping his hands on a rag with nervous energy. Brad looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world, but he was trapped behind the counter, with nowhere to go and no graceful way to exit the situation he'd created. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly, a technique I'd learned years ago for maintaining composure in high-stress situations. The key was to stay calm, to present facts without emotion, and to give people the opportunity to learn from their mistakes rather than simply punishing them for their ignorance. "My name is Maria Santos," I began, "and I've lived in this community for 3 years now, since I retired from the military. My brother Miguel has been a regular customer here for even longer, and he speaks very highly of this station and the people who work here. He told me it was a place where everyone was treated with respect, regardless of what they drove or how they dressed." Brad's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Frank was staring at me with growing interest, like he was starting to piece together information that didn't quite match the picture Brad had painted. "I drove here today in my Honda Civic, which I bought used because I believe in living below my means and not taking on unnecessary debt. I dressed casually because it's Saturday afternoon and I'm running errands, not attending a formal function. And yes, I paid cash up front when you requested it, because I respect your policies and understand that businesses need to protect themselves." I paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. What I didn't expect was to overhear myself described as someone who shops at Goodwill as if that were shameful, someone who can't afford gas as if financial struggle were a character flaw, and someone who collects government benefits, as if receiving help during difficult times were evidence of moral failing. Frank was nodding slowly, his expression shifting from discomfort to something that looked like understanding. Brad, meanwhile, had gone very quiet, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "The thing is," I continued, "even if those assumptions had been accurate, they wouldn't have justified the treatment or the commentary. A person's financial situation doesn't determine their worth, and making judgments about customers based on their appearance isn't just bad for business, it's fundamentally unkind." The station had fallen completely silent, except for the hum of the refrigeration units and the distant sound of traffic on Maple Street. I could see Brad processing what I said, wrestling with the collision between his assumptions and reality. Frank was watching him too, probably wondering how his young colleague was going to respond to being called out so directly, but so gently. Brad started, then stopped, his voice catching on words that wouldn't quite form. "I didn't mean—" "I know you didn't mean harm," I said, "and I genuinely meant it. Most people don't, but impact matters more than intent, and your words had impact, even if you didn't intend them to." Brad nodded slowly, looking younger than he had when I'd first walked in, like the confrontation had stripped away some of the artificial confidence he'd been wearing. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I was wrong to say those things. I was wrong to treat you differently because of how you looked." "Apology accepted," I said, "and I meant that too. The question now is what you do with this experience going forward." Frank stepped forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, you said you retired from the military. What branch?" I smiled, recognizing the genuine curiosity in his voice and the respect that had crept into his posture. "Army," I said. "I was a helicopter pilot for 28 years." 28 years, Frank repeated, clearly impressed. "That's a full career. You must have seen some action." "Some," I acknowledged, not elaborating because the details weren't relevant to the current situation, and because I'd learned that civilians often had complicated reactions to stories about combat deployments. But the important thing wasn't what I saw. It was what I learned about leadership and about treating people with dignity regardless of their circumstances. Brad was staring at me now with an expression I couldn't quite read, like he was trying to reconcile the woman standing in front of him with the assumptions he'd made earlier. I could see him working through the cognitive dissonance, realizing how completely wrong he'd been, not just about my circumstances, but about the entire framework he'd used to judge me. "You were really a pilot?" he asked, his voice small. "I was," I confirmed. "Flew UH-60 Blackhawks for most of my career. Some overseas deployments, some domestic operations. Finished up as a lieutenant colonel before I decided it was time to come home and be closer to family." Frank was shaking his head in amazement. "Lieutenant colonel," he said, clearly impressed. "That's serious rank. Thank you for your service, ma'am." "Thank you," I replied, "but please understand, I'm not telling you this to claim special treatment or to make anyone feel bad. I'm telling you because this is exactly the kind of situation where assumptions can be dangerous, where judging people based on limited information can lead us to miss the full picture." Brad looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, his face a mixture of embarrassment and what might have been the beginning of genuine remorse. "I feel like an idiot," he said quietly. "Don't," I said firmly. "Use this as a learning experience. Everyone makes mistakes, especially when we're young and think we understand more about the world than we actually do. The measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes, it's what they do afterward." I could see something shifting in Brad's expression, like a door opening to let in light where there had been shadow before. It was the look people got when they realized their worldview needed adjustment, when they understood that their assumptions had been based on incomplete information and flawed thinking. "Is there anything I can do to make this right?" he asked. And for the first time since I'd walked into the station, his voice carried genuine sincerity instead of defensive posturing. I considered the question seriously, thinking about what would actually be helpful rather than what might feel satisfying in the moment. Public apologies were often more about making the apologizer feel better than about creating real change, and I wasn't interested in humiliating anyone. Two things, I said finally. First, remember this conversation the next time you're tempted to make assumptions about someone based on their appearance. And second, maybe share this story with your friends and family. Help them understand why judging people by their clothes or their car might not be the best strategy. Brad nodded eagerly, like he was grateful to have concrete steps he could take to address his mistake. I will, he said. I promise I will. Frank was still shaking his head in amazement. Lieutenant Colonel, he repeated. I bet you've got some stories. Everyone has stories, I said with a smile. The trick is knowing when to tell them and when to listen to someone else's. And that was true, I reflected, as I prepared to leave the station for the second time that afternoon. Everyone did have stories, layers of experience and knowledge and history that weren't visible on the surface. The young man behind the counter might have stories about growing up in a household where financial insecurity bred resentment and fear. Frank might have stories about working with his hands his whole life and watching the world change around him in ways that sometimes felt threatening. The customers who came through this station every day all had stories that could surprise you if you took the time to listen. The difference was that some people used their stories as walls to keep others out, while others used them as bridges to connect with fellow human beings. Some people let their experiences make them smaller and more fearful, while others let them grow into more compassionate and understanding versions of themselves. As I walked back toward my car, I heard Brad call out behind me, "Ma'am, Colonel Santos?" I turned back to see him standing in the doorway of the station, his posture straighter than it had been earlier, his expression serious. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not just walking away, for taking the time to explain instead of just writing me off." I smiled and nodded, recognizing the sincerity in his voice and the courage it had taken for him to acknowledge his mistake so directly. "Thank you for listening. That's not always easy to do." As I drove away from the station, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd just had and the delicate dance between accountability and forgiveness that made up so much of human interaction. It would have been easy to simply report Brad's behavior to his manager, to demand consequences for his assumptions and unprofessional commentary. It would have been satisfying in a certain way, the kind of justice that felt clean and immediate. But real change rarely came from punishment alone. It came from understanding, from the hard work of examining your own beliefs and motivations, from the sometimes uncomfortable process of realizing that you'd been wrong about something important. And that kind of change could only happen when people felt safe enough to be vulnerable, when they believed that their mistakes could be learning experiences, rather than permanent marks against their character. I thought about my father, who had worked construction for 40 years and knew the value of building things slowly and carefully, with attention to detail and respect for the process. "You can tear something down in minutes," he used to say, "but building it right takes time and patience." Relationships were like that too, I reflected. Trust and understanding and mutual respect were built gradually, through countless small interactions and the accumulation of evidence that someone was worthy of your faith. But they could be damaged quickly, sometimes irreparably, by careless words or thoughtless actions. The afternoon sun was starting to sink lower in the sky as I made my way home, painting the familiar streets of my neighborhood in shades of gold and amber that reminded me why I'd chosen to settle here after decades of living in temporary quarters on military bases around the world. There was something about the permanence of civilian life that I was still learning to appreciate, the way relationships and routines could develop depth and meaning when you weren't constantly preparing for the next deployment or assignment. My phone buzzed with a text from Miguel. "How was your day, hermana? Did you get everything done?" I smiled as I typed back. "Interesting day. Got gas, had a conversation about assumptions and first impressions. Tell you about it when I see you." His response came quickly. "Sounds like there's a story there. Looking forward to hearing it." There was indeed a story there, I thought as I pulled into my driveway. A story about the danger of assumptions, about the power of patient correction, about the possibility of change when people were willing to listen and learn.
It wasn't the kind of dramatic story that made headlines or went viral on social media, but it was the kind of quiet human interaction that actually moved the world forward one conversation at a time. As I sat in my car for a moment before going inside, I found myself grateful for the unexpected opportunity to practice the kind of leadership I'd been taught in the military but rarely had occasion to use in civilian life. Not the leadership of command and authority, but the subtler art of helping people see past their own limitations and grow into better versions of themselves. Tomorrow there would be other errands to run, other interactions with strangers who might or might not share my values or worldview. There would be checkout clerks and waitresses and customer service representatives, each carrying their own stories and assumptions and ways of moving through the world. Some of those interactions would be smooth and pleasant, but others might require the same kind of patient correction I offered today. And that was okay, I realized. That was part of the ongoing work of being human, of participating in a community, of believing that people were capable of growth and change when given the right opportunities and incentives. It wasn't always easy work, and it didn't always produce the results you hoped for, but it was necessary work nonetheless. The important thing was to approach each interaction with curiosity rather than judgment, with hope rather than cynicism, with the understanding that everyone was doing their best with the tools and information they had available. Sometimes those tools were inadequate, and sometimes that information was incomplete or biased. But that didn't make the people who wielded them irredeemable. It just made them human, which was something I understood better than most after 43 years of being human myself, complete with all the mistakes and misunderstandings and moments of growth that came with the territory. The next morning started like any other Sunday in my quiet neighborhood, with the gentle sound of sprinklers watering lawns and the distant chime of church bells calling the faithful to worship. I was sitting on my back porch with my coffee, watching the sunrise paint my small garden in shades of rose and gold when my phone rang with Miguel's familiar ringtone. "Buenos dias, hermana." His voice carried the warm affection that had sustained our relationship through years of deployments and distance. "I've been thinking about that conversation you mentioned yesterday. Want to tell me what really happened?" I settled deeper into my wicker chair, cradling the warm mug between my hands as I recounted the events at the gas station. Miguel listened without interruption, the way he always did when something mattered, and I could picture him in his own kitchen making Sunday morning pancakes for his kids while processing what I was telling him. "So you told him about your rank?" he said when I finished, his tone carefully neutral. "I did," I confirmed, taking a sip of coffee that had gone lukewarm while I talked. It seemed like the right moment for a teaching opportunity.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Miguel was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear the subtle sounds of family life in the background, children's voices and the clatter of dishes that spoke to the peaceful domestic routine I'd never quite managed to create for myself. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of concern that made me pay closer attention. "Maria, you know I support whatever you choose to do, but I worry sometimes about you revealing your military background to strangers. There are people out there who have strong feelings about the wars, about military personnel, and not all of those feelings are positive." It was a conversation we'd had before, this gentle dance around my decision to be open about my service when the situation warranted it. Miguel had never served himself, though not for lack of patriotism or courage. His path had taken him toward family and community building, toward the kind of quiet civilian heroism that involved coaching Little League and volunteering at food banks and being the person neighbors called when they needed help moving furniture or fixing a leaky faucet. "I understand your concern," I said, watching a mockingbird work its way through its repertoire of borrowed songs in the oak tree that dominated my backyard. "But hiding who I am hasn't made me any happier, and it certainly hasn't made the world any better." "I'm not suggesting you hide," Miguel said quickly. "I'm just saying maybe you don't have to educate every ignorant person you encounter. Some people aren't worth the effort." His words carried the weight of brotherly protectiveness, the same instinct that had made him walk me to school when we were children and check up on me regularly now that we were adults living our separate lives. But they also reflected a fundamental difference in how we approached conflict and confrontation, a difference that had developed over the years as our experiences shaped us in different directions. Maybe not, I acknowledged, but how do we know which ones are worth it unless we try? Before Miguel could respond, I heard a commotion from the direction of the street, raised voices, and what sounded like someone shouting. I stood up from my chair, phone still pressed to my ear, and walked toward the front of my house to investigate. "Miguel, let me call you back," I said, ending the call and slipping my phone into the pocket of my pajama pants as I made my way through my living room to the front window. What I saw made my stomach drop and my training kick in automatically. Across the street, my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, was standing in her front yard in her bathrobe, pointing frantically at her house while talking rapidly to a young police officer who was taking notes. Behind them, I could see smoke beginning to seep from under her front door, thin gray wisps that spoke to a fire somewhere inside that was just beginning to find its voice. I didn't stop to think about the fact that I was wearing pajamas and slippers, didn't pause to consider whether this was my business or my responsibility. I simply moved, my body remembering decades of emergency response training as I jogged across the street toward the developing crisis. "Mrs. Chen," I called out as I approached, noting the way her hands shook as she gestured toward her house. "Are you hurt? Is anyone still inside?" The police officer looked up from his notepad, his young face showing the kind of controlled tension that came with responding to emergencies. "Ma'am, I need you to step back, please. This is an active scene." "Officer," I said, stopping where I was but keeping my voice calm and authoritative. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, retired Army. I live across the street and I have emergency response training. What's the situation?" His eyebrows rose slightly at my introduction, but his posture shifted subtly to acknowledge my credentials. "Mrs. Chen here says there's a fire somewhere inside her house, but she's not sure where it started. Fire department is en route, ETA about 6 minutes." Mrs. Chen turned toward me, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Maria, I was making breakfast and I smelled smoke, but I can't find where it's coming from. My husband is at the grocery store, and I don't know what to do." I could see the smoke getting thicker, seeping not just from under the front door now, but beginning to show at the edges of the windows facing the street. 6 minutes might be too long, especially if the fire was somewhere that would allow it to spread rapidly through the house's structure. "Officer, what's your name?" I asked, moving closer while keeping my movements non-threatening and professional. "Martinez," he said, and I felt a small jolt of recognition at the coincidence of names, though this was clearly not the moment to comment on it. "Officer Martinez, I'd like to do a quick assessment of the exterior to help determine the fire's location and severity before the fire department arrives, with your permission." He hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing protocol against practical necessity. "You said retired Army. What was your specialty?" "Helicopter pilot, but I also served as incident commander on multiple emergency response situations during my deployments. I know how to assess structural fire risks." Mrs. Chen grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone in her 70s. "Please, Maria, I have photo albums in there, pictures of my parents who died in China. If the house burns down..." I could see Officer Martinez making his decision, recognizing that 6 minutes could make the difference between a contained fire and a total loss. "Stay with me and follow my lead. If I tell you to back off, you back off immediately." "Understood," I said, already moving toward the side of Mrs. Chen's house where the smoke seemed less dense. The next few minutes unfolded with the strange clarity that came with emergency situations, time seeming to slow down while my senses sharpened to take in every detail that might matter. I could hear the distant sound of sirens beginning to approach, but they were still several blocks away, their wail muffled by the Sunday morning quiet of the neighborhood. Officer Martinez and I worked our way around the perimeter of Mrs. Chan's house, noting where the smoke was heaviest and where it seemed to be originating. The pattern suggested a fire in the back of the house, possibly in the kitchen or utility room, that was spreading forward through the interior structure. "There," I said, pointing to a basement window where smoke was now billowing more heavily. "Looks like it might have started in the basement and is working its way up. That's actually good news." Good news, Officer Martinez looked at me skeptically. It means we probably have more time before it reaches the main living areas, I explained, my mind automatically running through the fire progression scenarios I'd learned during military emergency response training. But it also means the structural damage could be more significant if it's been burning longer than Mrs. Chen realized. Mrs. Chen had followed us around the house despite our suggestions that she wait in the front yard, and I could see her anxiety increasing as the reality of the situation settled in. "My photo albums are upstairs," she said again, her voice small and frightened. "And my husband's coin collection, 40 years of collecting." I felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settling on my shoulders, the recognition that someone needed to make decisions and take action while others were paralyzed by fear or uncertainty. It was a feeling I'd experienced countless times during my military career, but it never got easier, never stopped carrying the burden of knowing that other people's well-being depended on your choices. "Mrs. Chen," I said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder, "the fire department will be here in just a few minutes, and they have equipment and training specifically for this situation. The most important thing right now is that you're safe." "But my pictures," she said, tears beginning to form in her eyes, "they're all I have left of my family." Officer Martinez was speaking into his radio, updating dispatch on the situation and requesting additional support. I could hear him explaining that the fire appeared to be in the basement, that there were no occupants currently inside, and that the homeowner was accounted for and safe. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold and my training snap into overdrive. From somewhere inside the house came a high-pitched whimpering, faint but unmistakable, the sound of an animal in distress. "Mrs. Chen," I said urgently, "do you have any pets inside?" Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes going wide with horror. "Whiskers," she gasped, "my cat. He likes to hide in the basement when he's scared. Oh God, I forgot about Whiskers." Officer Martinez heard the exchange and shook his head firmly. "Ma'am, no one is going into that house until the fire department arrives and clears it. It's too dangerous." I understood his position, appreciated his adherence to protocol and his concern for civilian safety, but I also understood something else, something that came from years of making split-second decisions in situations where following protocol might mean the difference between saving lives and losing them. The fire department was still at least 4 minutes away, possibly longer if they hit traffic or had trouble locating the house. The smoke was getting thicker, which meant the fire was spreading, and the basement where the cat was hiding would likely be filling with toxic gases that could kill an animal in minutes. 4 minutes might be too long. I looked at Mrs. Chen's face, saw the anguish there as she realized her beloved pet was trapped inside a burning house, and felt something familiar stir in my chest. It was the same feeling I'd had in Afghanistan when we'd received word that civilians were trapped in a compound under fire. The same clarity that had guided me through dozens of emergency situations where the rulebook offered guidelines but reality demanded adaptation. "Officer Martinez," I said, keeping my voice calm and professional, "I need you to understand something. I've been in dozens of emergency situations during my military career, including structural fires and rescue operations. I know how to assess risk and move quickly through compromised buildings." "Ma'am, I cannot authorize a civilian to enter a burning building," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "I understand your training, but the liability issues alone." "I'm not asking for authorization," I interrupted gently. "I'm informing you of my intention and asking that you trust my judgment based on my experience." Mrs. Chen was crying openly now, her hands pressed to her face as she listened to our exchange. "Please," she whispered, "he's all I have since my husband got sick. Please don't let him die in there." Officer Martinez looked torn, clearly wrestling with the conflict between protocol and practicality, between his duty to prevent civilians from taking risks and his recognition that sometimes rules had to bend in the face of human need. "The fire department will be here in 3 minutes," he said finally. "Can you wait 3 minutes?" I listened carefully, trying to gauge the situation inside the house based on the sounds filtering through the walls. The cat's cries were getting fainter, which could mean it was moving deeper into the basement to escape the smoke, Or it could mean something much worse. 3 minutes might be too long, I said quietly. Smoke inhalation kills faster than fire, especially for small animals. I could see the moment when Officer Martinez made his decision, his shoulders settling slightly as he accepted that this was one of those situations where perfect protocol had to give way to imperfect reality. If you're going in there, he said slowly, you wear my spare protective gear, you stay in radio contact, and you have 90 seconds maximum before I come in after you. Deal, I said, already moving toward his patrol car where I could see the emergency equipment stored in the trunk. The next few minutes moved with the surreal efficiency that characterized emergency situations, everything happening quickly but with deliberate precision. Officer Martinez helped me into a basic fire safety vest and breathing apparatus, equipment that wasn't designed for civilian rescue operations but would provide some protection against smoke inhalation. 90 seconds, he repeated as I checked the radio clipped to the vest. In and out, no heroics. I nodded, understanding his concern, but also knowing that 90 seconds might not be enough if the cat was hiding deep in the basement or if the layout of the house was more complex than it appeared from outside. Mrs. Chen grabbed my hand as I prepared to enter through the back door, where the smoke seemed less dense than at the front of the house. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "I know this is dangerous, and I know you don't have to do this." "It's going to be okay," I told her, though we both knew I couldn't guarantee that. "Whiskers is going to be fine." The back door was unlocked, and I opened it carefully, immediately hit by a wall of acrid smoke that made my eyes water despite the protective gear. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of burning wood and synthetic materials that spoke to a fire that had been consuming household items for longer than Mrs. Chen had realized. I dropped to my hands and knees, remembering from emergency training that smoke rises and the air would be clearer closer to the floor. The kitchen was filled with gray haze, but not yet engulfed in flames, and I could see well enough to navigate toward what I hoped was the basement entrance. "Martinez, I'm inside," I spoke into the radio, my voice muffled by the breathing apparatus. "Copy that," came his reply. "You've got 70 seconds." I found the basement door standing open, which explained why the smoke had spread through the house so quickly. The stairway descended into darkness, broken only by the orange glow of flames somewhere below, and I could hear the crackling sound of wood burning steadily. The cat's cries were clearer now, coming from somewhere to my left at the bottom of the stairs. I descended quickly but carefully, testing each step before putting my full weight on it, aware that fire damage could compromise the structural integrity of the wooden stairs. The basement was a maze of storage boxes and old furniture, typical of the kind of accumulated possessions that families gathered over decades of living in the same house. The fire seemed to be concentrated in the area around the furnace and water heater, probably an electrical malfunction that had ignited nearby stored materials. "Whiskers," I called out, listening for the response that would guide me toward the trapped animal. The answering meow came from behind a stack of boxes near the far wall, an area that wasn't yet threatened by flames, but was filling rapidly with smoke. I worked my way through the obstacle course of stored items, moving as quickly as possible while being careful not to knock over anything that might block my exit route. The heat was increasing noticeably, and I could see flames beginning to spread from their original source toward other combustible materials scattered throughout the basement. 60 seconds, Officer Martinez's voice crackled through the radio. Behind the stack of boxes, I found Whiskers huddled in a corner, his orange fur singed but his eyes alert and responsive. He was a large cat, probably 15 pounds, and clearly frightened but not seriously injured. When I reached for him, he didn't resist, allowing me to scoop him up and tuck him inside the front of my protective vest where he would be shielded from the worst of the smoke. "I've got him," I radioed as I began making my way back toward the stairs. "Coming out now." The return trip felt longer than the descent, partly because I was carrying the cat and partly because the smoke had gotten thicker in the few minutes I'd been in the basement. I could hear the fire spreading behind me, consuming materials that would fuel its growth and accelerate its movement through the rest of the house. By the time I reached the kitchen, I could hear the sound of fire trucks arriving outside, their sirens cutting through the morning quiet as emergency responders prepared to take over the situation. I made it to the back door just as Officer Martinez appeared, his face showing relief mixed with professional concern. "You're 30 seconds over," he said as I emerged into the fresh air, immediately unzipping the vest to release Whiskers into Mrs. Chen's waiting arms. "Sorry about that," I said, pulling off the breathing apparatus and taking deep gulps of clean air. He was hiding pretty deep in there. Mrs. Chen was crying again, but these were tears of joy and relief as she held her rescued cat against her chest. Whiskers seemed remarkably calm for an animal that had just been through a traumatic experience, purring softly as his owner stroked his singed fur. "Thank you," Mrs. Chen said through her tears. "I don't know how to thank you enough." "No thanks necessary," I said, though I had to admit there was a satisfaction in the successful rescue that reminded me why I'd chosen a career in service. "I'm just glad we got him out in time." The fire department had arrived in force, with multiple trucks and crews that immediately began the work of containing and extinguishing the blaze. I watched them deploy with the practiced efficiency of professionals who dealt with emergencies every day, their movements coordinated and purposeful in a way that spoke to extensive training and experience. The incident commander, a woman in her 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to making critical decisions under pressure, approached our small group as her crews began their assault on the fire. "I'm Chief Rodriguez," she said, extending her hand first to Officer Martinez and then to me. "I understand we had a civilian rescue operation before we arrived." Officer Martinez nodded toward me. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Santos, retired Army. She went in to retrieve Mrs. Chen's cat when it became clear the animal wouldn't survive until we could establish a safe entry." Chief Rodriguez studied me with the appraising look of one professional evaluating another. "Lieutenant Colonel," she said, her tone carrying respect but also a note of mild reproof. "I appreciate your training and your willingness to help, but unauthorized entry into a burning building puts both you and my crew at risk." "I understand your position, Chief," I replied, "and I respect the protocols you have to follow. But the situation required immediate action, and I had the training and equipment necessary to execute a safe rescue." She nodded slowly, clearly torn between official disapproval and professional recognition of a job well done. "The cat appears unharmed." Mrs. Chen held Whiskers up slightly, and Chief Rodriguez could see for herself that the animal, while probably stressed, had suffered no serious injury from his ordeal. "He seems fine," Mrs. Chen said, her voice still thick with emotion. "Thanks to Maria, he's perfectly fine." Chief Rodriguez's expression softened slightly. "Well, I can't officially condone unauthorized civilian rescue operations, but I can say that your quick action probably saved this animal's life. The basement will be completely compromised within the next few minutes." As if to underscore her point, we could hear the sound of the fire spreading inside the house, the crackling and popping of wood and other materials being consumed by flames that had found fresh fuel and oxygen. "What's the prognosis for the house?" I asked, though I could already guess the answer from the volume of smoke pouring from the windows and the intensity of the flames visible through the basement entrance. "Total loss on the basement level, significant damage to the first floor, possible salvage of some items from the second floor if we can get the fire contained quickly," Chief Rodriguez said with the blunt honesty that emergency professionals learn to deliver. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Chen. I know this is your home." Mrs. Chen nodded, clutching Whiskers tighter but maintaining a composure that spoke to a lifetime of dealing with hardship and loss. "It's just a house," she said quietly. "Houses can be rebuilt. But Whiskers," she looked at me with gratitude that made my throat tighten, "Whiskers can't be replaced." Over the next hour, I stayed with Mrs. Chen as the firefighters worked to contain the blaze and prevent it from spreading to neighboring properties. Her husband arrived home from the grocery store to find his street blocked by emergency vehicles and his house being consumed by flames, and I watched him process the shock with the kind of stunned disbelief that come with sudden, life-altering events. But I also watched the community respond, neighbors appearing with offers of help and support, bringing coffee and blankets and the kind of practical assistance that people provided during emergencies. Someone offered the use of their phone so Mrs. Chen could call her insurance company. Another neighbor volunteered to house Whiskers temporarily while the Chen family figured out their next steps. Officer Martinez stayed throughout the incident, both to complete his report and, I suspected, to observe how the situation developed. During a quiet moment while the firefighters worked and Mrs. Chen talked with her insurance representative, he approached me with a thoughtful expression. "Colonel Santos," he said, "I wanted to thank you for your professionalism today. You handled a difficult situation with exactly the kind of judgment and skill I'd expect from someone with your background." "Thank you, Officer Martinez," I replied, "and thank you for trusting my assessment and supporting the rescue operation." He was quiet for a moment, watching the firefighters work with their hoses and axes and specialized equipment. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "Of course." "My grandfather was Colonel Martinez, Army, served in Vietnam. When people heard his name and rank, they treated him differently, sometimes with respect, sometimes with suspicion or hostility. How do you handle that?" It was an interesting question, one that spoke to the complex relationship between military service and civilian society, especially in an era when public opinion about military actions was often divided and polarized. "Your grandfather sounds like he was a good man who served with honor," I said. "The way people react to military service says more about them than it does about us. Some people understand the sacrifice and commitment involved. Others don't. Our job isn't to manage their reactions, it's to continue living according to the values we learned in service." Officer Martinez nodded thoughtfully. He used to say something similar, said the uniform came off, but the responsibility never did. "Smart man," I said. "The responsibility to serve, to protect, to help when we can. That doesn't end when we retire." Chief Rodriguez appeared beside us, pulling off her helmet and wiping sweat from her forehead. "We've got it contained," she announced. "No spread to adjacent structures, and we'll have it completely extinguished within the hour." Mrs. Chen broke away from her conversation with the insurance representative and approached our small group. "Chief, what about my husband's coin collection and my photo albums upstairs?" Chief Rodriguez's expression was gentle but realistic. "We'll do our best to salvage what we can from the upper level, but I need you to understand that even if items survive the fire, they may have smoke and water damage that makes them unusable." I could see Mrs. Chen struggling with the reality of losing irreplaceable family memories, the photographs and mementos that connected her to parents and siblings who had died years ago in a country she'd left behind decades earlier. "Mrs. Chen," I said gently, "would you like me to go with the firefighters when they do the salvage operation? I know which items are most important to you, and I might be able to help them prioritize what to save." Her face lit up with hope and gratitude. "Would you? I know it's asking a lot, but those pictures." Chief Rodriguez looked at me with renewed respect. "You don't quit, do you, Colonel?" "Not when there's still work to be done," I said simply. 20 minutes later, I was following two firefighters through the smoke-damaged interior of Mrs. Chen's house, wearing full protective gear and breathing apparatus as we navigated carefully through rooms where water from their hoses mixed with soot and ash to create a slippery, treacherous mess. The second floor had suffered significant smoke damage but remained structurally sound, and we were able to locate Mrs. Chen's photo albums in a bedroom closet where they'd been protected from the worst of the heat and moisture. The coin collection proved more challenging, stored in a heavy safe in the master bedroom that would require specialized equipment to move. "We can get the safe out," one of the firefighters assured me as we prepared to leave the house, "but it'll have to wait until we're sure the structure is completely stable." I emerged from the house carrying 3 photo albums wrapped in protective plastic, along with a jewelry box that Mrs. Chen had mentioned contained her grandmother's wedding ring and other family heirlooms. It wasn't much compared to a lifetime of accumulated possessions, but I could see from Mrs. Chen's reaction that it represented something precious and irreplaceable. "My parents," she said softly, opening one of the albums to reveal black and white photographs of a young couple standing in front of what looked like a traditional Chinese building. I thought they were gone forever. Her husband, who had been quiet throughout most of the emergency, spoke up for the first time since arriving home to find his house on fire. "Thank you," he said simply, his accented English carrying a weight of emotion that needed no elaboration. As the emergency responders began packing up their equipment and preparing to leave, I found myself reflecting on the strange sequence of events that had led me from a quiet Sunday morning coffee to a basement rescue operation to helping a neighbor salvage family treasures from a burning house.
It wasn't the kind of dramatic heroism that made headlines or earned medals, but it was the kind of service that military training had prepared me for without my even realizing it. The ability to assess situations quickly, to move decisively when action was required, to prioritize human and animal welfare over personal safety, to remain calm under pressure while helping others navigate crisis. Officer Martinez appeared beside me as I watched the fire trucks prepare to depart. "Quite a morning," he said with a slight smile. "Not exactly what I had planned," I admitted, looking down at my pajamas and slippers that were now covered in soot and ash. "But I'm glad we were able to help." "Mrs. Chen is lucky to have a neighbor like you," he said. "Not everyone would risk going into a burning building for someone else's cat." I thought about that comment as I finally made my way back across the street to my own house, where my coffee mug still sat on the back porch where I'd abandoned it when the emergency began. Officer Martinez was right that not everyone would have made the choice I'd made, but I also knew that most people never found themselves in situations where such choices were necessary. The difference wasn't courage or character, necessarily. The difference was training and experience, the kind of preparation that taught you to move toward problems instead of away from them, to see emergencies as opportunities for service rather than situations to avoid. My phone was buzzing with missed calls and text messages, including several from Miguel, who had probably been wondering why I'd hung up so abruptly. I scrolled through the notifications, seeing messages from neighbors who had heard about the fire and wanted to make sure I was okay, and one from a number I didn't recognize. The unknown number had left a voicemail, and when I played it back, I heard a young male voice that sounded familiar. Colonel Santos? This is Brad, from the gas station yesterday. I heard about what happened at Mrs. Chen's house this morning, and I just wanted to call and say, after what you did for that family." He paused, clearly struggling with how to express whatever he was feeling. "I guess what I'm trying to say is thank you for showing me that being a real person means helping others, even when they haven't earned it. I hope I can learn to be more like that." I saved the message and sat down on my porch steps, finally allowing myself to process the events of the morning and their connection to the conversation I'd had at the gas station the day before. It was interesting how life created these patterns, these opportunities to demonstrate values, rather than simply talking about them. Brad's message suggested that our conversation had made an impact, that the teaching moment had planted seeds that were already beginning to grow. And this morning's rescue operation had provided an example of service in action, the kind of practical demonstration that was worth more than 100 speeches about duty and responsibility. My phone rang again, this time with Miguel's familiar ringtone. When I answered, his voice carried the urgent concern of someone who had been trying to reach a loved one during an emergency. "Maria, what happened? I've been calling for hours, and now I'm hearing something about a fire and a rescue operation." "It's been an interesting morning," I said, settling back against the porch steps as I prepared to tell him about Whiskers and Mrs. Chen and the unexpected ways that military training continued to shape civilian life. "Are you hurt? Are you safe?" "I'm fine," I assured him.
Tired, and I smell like smoke, but fine. The cat's fine too. The cat? It's a long story, I said with a smile, looking across the street where Mrs. Chen and her husband were talking with insurance adjusters and beginning the long process of rebuilding their lives after an unexpected disaster. But I think you're going to like how it ends. 3 weeks after the fire, I was back at the gas station, needing to fill up before driving to the airport to pick up Miguel's oldest daughter who was coming to visit for spring break. The morning air carried the fresh scent of rain from the night before, and the early sunshine made everything look newly washed and hopeful. As I pulled up to the same pump where this whole adventure had started, I noticed some changes. There was a new sign by the front door advertising military discounts, and someone had planted flower boxes under the windows that added a welcoming touch to the practical functionality of the service station. Brad was behind the counter again, but his posture was different somehow, more attentive and less defensive. When I walked inside, he looked up immediately and offered a genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "Good morning, Colonel Santos," he said, and I could hear the respect in his voice that hadn't been there during our first encounter. "How can I help you today?" "Just filling up at Pump 4, I said, noting how he'd remembered my rank without any prompting. And it's just Maria, Brad. I'm not in uniform anymore. Yes, ma'am, he said, then caught himself and grinned sheepishly. I mean, yes, Maria, but I hope you don't mind if it takes me a while to get used to that. What you did for Mrs. Chen, what you've done for this whole neighborhood, it means something. Frank emerged from the service bay, wiping his hands on a rag and beaming when he saw me. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd become something of a regular fixture in conversations about the fire and rescue, apparently telling anyone who would listen about the retired Army helicopter pilot who lived across the street from the gas station. "Morning, Colonel," Frank said warmly. "How's Mrs. Chen doing with the temporary housing situation?" "She's managing well," I replied, appreciating his genuine concern for our neighbor. "The insurance company has been more helpful than expected, and her family from California is coming next week to help with the rebuilding decisions." "That's wonderful," Brad said, and I could see he meant it. "I've been thinking about what you said that day, about not judging people by their appearance, and I wanted you to know that conversation changed how I see things." Frank nodded enthusiastically. "Brad's been a different person since then, haven't you, son? More thoughtful, more respectful with customers. Even old Mr. Patterson commented on it, and you know how particular he is about service." I felt a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the morning sunshine streaming through the station windows. This was the kind of change that mattered, the slow transformation of attitudes and assumptions that happened one conversation at a time. "I'm glad to hear that," I said sincerely. "But you should know that the capacity for growth and change was always there. I just helped point you in a direction you were already capable of going." Brad's expression grew thoughtful. "Can I ask you something? I've been wondering about this for weeks." "Of course. When you were in the Army, did you ever have to deal with people who had the wrong idea about you? I mean, being a woman in the military must have been challenging." It was a perceptive question, one that showed he'd been thinking seriously about the dynamics of assumption and prejudice rather than just applying our conversation to customer service situations. "Every day," I said honestly. "There were always people who assumed I couldn't handle the physical demands, or that I was too emotional for command decisions, or that I was only there to fill some diversity quota. The key was proving them wrong through performance rather than argument." Frank was listening intently, his weathered face showing the concentration of someone processing new information. "But that must have been exhausting, having to prove yourself over and over." "It was," I acknowledged, "but it also made me stronger and more determined. And eventually, most people came around when they saw that I could do the job as well as anyone else." Brad was nodding slowly. "Like how we came around after seeing what kind of person you really are." "Exactly. The difference is that you were willing to listen and learn when the evidence contradicted your assumptions. Not everyone is." The bell above the door chimed as another customer entered, an elderly man I recognized as Mr. Patterson, whom Frank had mentioned. He was wearing a Vietnam veteran's baseball cap and walked with the careful precision of someone whose body carried the accumulated wear of decades. "Morning, Frank," Mr. Patterson said in a gravelly voice. "Morning, Brad." His eyes settled on me with the appraising look of someone trying to place a face in context. Frank stepped forward with obvious enthusiasm. "Mr. Patterson, I'd like you to meet Colonel Maria Santos. She's the one I was telling you about, the helicopter pilot who saved Mrs. Chen's cat and helped with the fire rescue." Mr. Patterson's expression shifted to one of recognition and respect. He removed his cap, revealing hair that was completely white, and extended his hand in a firm grip. "Colonel," he said simply, "Frank's told me quite a story about your service and your recent heroics. It's an honor to meet you." "The honor is mine, Mr. Patterson," I replied, noticing the Vietnam service ribbon on his cap and the way he carried himself with military bearing despite his age. "Thank you for your service. 101st Airborne, 1968 to 1970, he said. "What was your unit?"
101 as well, actually. Different era, but same proud tradition. His face lit up with the special camaraderie that existed between people who had served in the same unit, regardless of when or where their service had taken place. "Screaming Eagles," he said with satisfaction. "Once an Eagle, always an Eagle." "Air assault," I replied, completing the traditional unit response. Brad and Frank were watching this exchange with fascination, clearly observing a type of connection they'd never witnessed before. There was something in the recognition between veterans that transcended generational differences and created instant bonds based on shared understanding of service and sacrifice. "You know," Mr. Patterson said, settling into what was obviously a favorite topic of conversation, "I've been coming to this station for 15 years, and Frank and I have had many discussions about what's wrong with young people today. But Brad here has been impressing me lately with his improved attitude and professionalism." Brad flushed slightly at the unexpected praise. "Mr. Patterson, I've been trying to apply some lessons I learned recently about treating people with respect regardless of their circumstances." "Good man," Mr. Patterson said approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of lesson that makes the difference between a boy and a man." I found myself thinking about the ripple effects of that original conversation with Brad, how a single teaching moment had apparently influenced not just his behavior, but his entire approach to interacting with others. It was a reminder that change was possible when people were willing to examine their assumptions and adjust their behavior accordingly. "Colonel Santos," Mr. Patterson continued, "Frank tells me you're retired and living in the neighborhood. Have you considered joining our local Veterans of Foreign Wars post? We meet twice a month, and we're always looking for new members who understand the importance of community service." "I haven't really thought about it," I admitted. "I've been trying to figure out how I fit into civilian life, what my role should be now that I'm not actively serving." Mr. Patterson chuckled, a sound that carried decades of wisdom and experience. "Colonel, I've been retired from active duty for over 50 years, and I can tell you that the service never really ends. It just changes form." His words resonated with something I'd been struggling to articulate, the sense that retirement from the military didn't mean retirement from the responsibility to serve and protect that had defined my adult life. "What kind of community service does your VFW post focus on?" I asked, genuinely curious about the possibilities. "Emergency preparedness training for local residents, support for military families during deployments, coordination with first responders during natural disasters," Frank answered, apparently familiar with their activities. "Mr. Patterson and his group have been instrumental in organizing disaster relief efforts during the last few flood seasons. And we sponsor a youth program that teaches leadership skills and civic responsibility to high school students, the kind of training that might have helped someone like Brad develop better judgment earlier in life." Brad grimaced good-naturedly at the gentle teasing. "I deserve that," he said, "but I'm grateful for the chance to learn from my mistakes." "That's all any of us can do," Mr. Patterson said with approval. "Learn from our mistakes and try to do better tomorrow than we did today." As our conversation continued, I found myself thinking about the unexpected ways that life had a tendency to create opportunities for service and connection. 3 weeks ago, I had been focused on maintaining my anonymity and avoiding the complications that came with revealing my military background. Now, I was being invited to join a veterans organization and considering how my training and experience might benefit the broader community. The bell chimed again as another customer entered, and I recognized Mrs. Chen, looking much more composed than she had during the crisis 3 weeks earlier. She was carrying Whiskers in a travel carrier, and both of them appeared healthy and settled despite their temporary housing situation. "Maria," she said warmly, approaching our small group with obvious pleasure. "How wonderful to see you." "Mrs. Chen," I replied, noting how Whiskers seemed alert and curious rather than traumatized by his brush with disaster. "How are you both adjusting to the apartment?" "Very well, thank you. The insurance company has been more helpful than we expected, and we should be able to start rebuilding within the next month." She paused, her expression growing serious. "I wanted to thank you again for what you did. Not just saving Whiskers, but helping us salvage those photographs. They mean more to us than I can express." Frank stepped forward with obvious interest. "Mrs. Chen, this is Mr. Patterson, one of our regular customers. Mr. Patterson, this is the neighbor Colonel Santos rescued the cat for during that house fire a few weeks ago." Mr. Patterson extended his hand to Mrs. Chen with old-fashioned courtesy. "Ma'am, I'm honored to meet you. I've heard quite a story about your neighbor's heroism and your family's resilience during a difficult time." Mrs. Chen smiled, clearly pleased by the introduction. "Mr. Patterson, Maria has been such a blessing to our family. When I think about what could have happened if she hadn't been there, the important thing is that she was there," Mr. Patterson said firmly. "That's what good neighbors do. That's what good people do." Brad had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding, and I could see him processing the connections between our original conversation about assumptions and the reality of community support during times of crisis. "Mrs. Chen," Brad said hesitantly, I just wanted to say that I'm glad everything worked out, and if there's anything this station can do to help during your rebuilding process, please let us know." She looked at him with surprise and gratitude. "That's very kind of you. Actually, with all the insurance appointments and contractor meetings, having a reliable place nearby to get gas and basic supplies has been a real convenience." "Well, you're always welcome here," Frank said warmly. "And if you need anything beyond what we stock, just ask. We know all the local suppliers and contractors." I watched this interaction with a growing sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal recognition and everything to do with witnessing the kind of community support that made neighborhoods into real places where people cared about each other's well-being. "You know," Mrs. Chen said thoughtfully, "this experience has taught me something important about asking for help and accepting kindness from others. For too many years, my husband and I tried to be completely self-sufficient, but this fire showed us how much we depend on our neighbors and community." Mr. Patterson nodded approvingly. "That's a lesson that took me years to learn, ma'am. There's strength in independence, but there's wisdom in recognizing when we need each other." As I listened to this conversation, I found myself reflecting on my own journey toward accepting community and connection after years of military life where self-reliance and mission focus were paramount. The transition to civilian life had required learning new ways of being helpful, new forms of service that were less dramatic but equally important. My phone buzzed with a text message from Miguel. "Flight delayed by an hour. Sophia will be on the 2:15 instead of 1:15. Thanks for picking her up." "Family arriving?" Mr. Patterson asked, apparently noticing my attention to the phone. "My niece, coming for spring break," I explained. "She's a sophomore at UC Davis, studying environmental science." "Wonderful," Mrs. Chen said enthusiastically. "Young people with passion for protecting the environment give me hope for the future." Brad looked up from restocking merchandise behind the counter. "Colonel Santos, can I ask what it's like having family members who know about your military service? I mean, do they see you differently because of what you did?" It was another thoughtful question, one that suggested he was continuing to think seriously about the complexities of identity and recognition. "They've always known who I am," I said. "For them, I'm not Colonel Santos the war hero. I'm Aunt Maria who sends birthday cards and helps with college applications and makes terrible jokes at family dinners." Frank laughed at that. "Sounds like my kids. They're more impressed by my ability to fix their cars than by anything I might have accomplished in my younger days." "That's how it should be," Mr. Patterson said sagely. "Family sees you for who you are, not what you've done. The rest of the world might focus on titles and accomplishments, but family focuses on character and love." Mrs. Chen was nodding in agreement. "My grandchildren in California know their grandmother as someone who makes dumplings and tells stories, not as someone who survived the Cultural Revolution and immigrated to America with nothing but hope and determination." "But don't you think," Brad said carefully, "that the things you've all accomplished and survived are part of what makes you who you are? I mean, Colonel Santos, your military training is part of what enabled you to save Whiskers and help Mrs. Chen. That's not separate from who you are as a person." I was impressed by the sophistication of his thinking, the way he was grappling with questions about identity and character that many people never seriously considered. "You're absolutely right," I said. "The training and experience are part of who I am, but they're not the whole story. The goal is integration, finding ways to use what you've learned in service of the life you're building now." Mr. Patterson was studying Brad with obvious approval. "Son, you've been asking some very mature questions today. Have you given any thought to your future beyond this job?" Brad's expression grew thoughtful. "Actually, I have. These conversations with Colonel Santos have made me think about different ways to serve the community. I've been looking into the community college's emergency medical technician program." Frank's eyebrows rose in surprise. "EMT training? That's serious business, Brad." "I know," Brad said, his voice carrying a new confidence. "But I've been thinking about what Colonel Santos said about using your abilities to help people, and I think I'd like to try being someone who responds to emergencies instead of someone who just watches them happen." I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with personal credit and everything to do with witnessing someone choosing a path of service based on their own growing understanding of responsibility and community.
"That's excellent, Brad," I said sincerely. "EMT work is challenging and rewarding, and this community would benefit from having someone with your newfound perspective in that role." Mrs. Chen was beaming at this revelation. "How wonderful that our little neighborhood is producing another emergency responder. After what happened with the fire, I have such appreciation for people who choose careers helping others during their worst moments." "The EMT program has a good reputation," Mr. Patterson added. "And if you're serious about emergency response, our VFW post works closely with the local fire department and EMS services. We might be able to provide some mentoring and support during your training." I watched Brad's face light up at this unexpected offer of assistance and realized that we were witnessing the formation of exactly the kind of community connections that made neighborhoods stronger and more resilient. "Mr. Patterson, that would be incredible," Brad said. "I was worried about the training being too expensive, but if there are ways to get support—"
There are always ways to help young people who are serious about serving their community, Mr. Patterson said firmly. The key is demonstrating commitment and character, which you seem to be developing quite nicely. Frank was nodding enthusiastically. Brad, if you go through with this EMT training, I'll work with your schedule here at the station. Emergency response skills would make you even more valuable as an employee, and this community needs people like you. As I listened to this conversation unfold, I found myself thinking about the unexpected ways that a single moment of confrontation and education had led to genuine transformation and new possibilities. Brad wasn't just changing his attitude about customer service, he was reconsidering his entire life direction based on new understanding about service and responsibility. "You know," I said thoughtfully, "this conversation reminds me why I decided to be open about my military background that day. Sometimes people are ready to grow and change, but they need examples and encouragement to show them what's possible." Mrs. Chen was nodding vigorously. "And sometimes people need to see that helping others isn't about being a hero, it's about being human and caring about your community." "Exactly," Mr. Patterson said. "The real heroes aren't the ones who seek attention or recognition. They're the ones who see problems and step forward to help, whether that's rescuing a cat from a burning building or changing careers to become an emergency responder." Brad was listening to this exchange with obvious emotion, his young face showing the kind of determination that suggested he was serious about the path he was considering. "Colonel Santos," he said quietly, "I want you to know that conversation we had about assumptions and respect, it didn't just change how I treat customers, it changed how I see myself and what I want to do with my life." "That's the best possible outcome," I replied, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from witnessing genuine positive change in another person. "But remember, the capacity for that change was always inside you. I just helped you see it." Frank was wiping his eyes surreptitiously, clearly moved by the transformation he'd witnessed in his young colleague. "Brad, I'm proud of you, son. Really proud." Mrs. Chen reached into her purse and pulled out a small wrapped package. "Maria, I brought something for you. It's not much, but I wanted you to have it." I unwrapped the tissue paper to reveal a small framed photograph, black and white, showing a young couple standing in front of what appeared to be a traditional Chinese building. The woman was holding a baby, and both adults were smiling, despite the formal pose typical of photographs from that era. "These are my parents," Mrs. Chen explained, "holding me when I was about 6 months old. This photograph survived the fire because you saved those albums, and I wanted you to have a copy because you saved more than just pictures that day. You saved our family's history." I felt my throat tighten with emotion as I looked at the photograph, understanding the profound significance of this gift. "Mrs. Chen, this is beautiful, but are you sure you want to give it away?" "I'm not giving it away," she said softly. "I'm sharing it with family, because that's what you are now, Maria. Family." Mr. Patterson cleared his throat, clearly moved by the moment. "Ma'am, that's one of the finest gifts I've ever seen given, and Colonel, I hope you understand the honor you've been paid." I did understand, perhaps better than I could express. This small photograph represented trust and gratitude and inclusion in the kind of family bonds that transcended blood relationships and were based instead on shared experience and mutual care. "Thank you," I said simply. knowing that no elaborate words could adequately convey my appreciation for the gesture and what it represented. As I prepared to leave the station to drive to the airport, I reflected on how much had changed in just 3 weeks. What had started as a routine stop for gasoline had evolved into a web of connections and relationships that enriched not just my own life, but the entire community. Brad was considering a career in emergency response, inspired by our conversation about service and responsibility. Mr. Patterson had extended an invitation to join a veterans organization that could provide new outlets for my desire to continue serving. Mrs. Chen had included me in her definition of family, creating bonds that would last far beyond the immediate crisis that had brought us together. "Colonel Santos," Frank called out as I reached the door, "I hope you'll consider Mr. Patterson's invitation to join the VFW. This community could use more people like you in leadership positions." "I'll definitely think about it," I promised, realizing that I was no longer thinking about it as much as I was planning how to make it work with my schedule and other commitments. Brad stepped forward with a shy smile. "And Colonel, I hope you'll let me know how the EMT training goes. Maybe you could share some insights about emergency response from your military experience." "I'd be happy to," I said, appreciating his continued eagerness to learn and grow. "And Brad, I think you're going to make an excellent EMT. You have the right combination of compassion and determination." As I drove toward the airport to collect my niece, I found myself thinking about the unexpected ways that life creates opportunities for connection and service. 3 weeks ago, I had been focused on maintaining privacy and avoiding the complications that came with revealing my military background. Now, I was actively considering ways to become more involved in community service and emergency preparedness. The transformation hadn't been dramatic or sudden, but it had been profound. I was still the same person who valued quiet service over public recognition, but I was no longer hiding from the responsibilities that came with my training and experience. My phone rang as I pulled into the airport parking garage, and I saw Miguel's name on the screen. "How's the hero business today?" he asked, with the gentle teasing that had characterized our relationship since childhood. "Quiet," I said. "Just the usual routine of filling up the gas tank and discovering that people are capable of remarkable growth when given the right encouragement." "Ah," Miguel said knowingly. "So it was that kind of routine day." "The best kind," I replied, thinking about Brad's career plans and Mr. Patterson's invitation and Mrs. Chen's precious gift. The kind where you realize that community isn't something you join, it's something you build one conversation at a time. And now you're picking up my daughter, who's going to want to hear every detail of your latest adventure in civilian heroism. "It wasn't heroism," I protested automatically. "It was just neighbors helping neighbors."
"Hermana," Miguel said gently, "that's exactly what heroism looks like in peacetime, and I'm proud of you for finally figuring that out." As I walked through the airport toward the arrival gate where Sophia would soon appear, I carried with me the small framed photograph that represented so much more than just a family memory. It represented the possibility of belonging, of building connections that mattered, of finding new ways to serve that were quieter but no less important than military missions. The transformation from Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos to Maria the neighbor had been gradual and sometimes difficult, but it was finally complete. I was still the same person who had flown helicopters and led soldiers and made split-second decisions under fire, but I was also someone who could save cats and encourage young people and accept gifts of family photographs with the gratitude they deserved. The best part was that both versions of myself could coexist comfortably, each informing and strengthening the other in ways that made me more effective at building the kind of community where everyone had the opportunity to grow and contribute according to their abilities and circumstances. As Sophia emerged from the arrival gate with her backpack and her bright smile, I realized that I was finally ready to tell her stories about both the soldier I had been and the neighbor I was becoming, understanding that both were essential parts of the person I was meant to be. 6 months later, I stood in the community center wearing my dress uniform for the first time in years, watching as Brad received his EMT certification in front of a crowd that included his parents, Frank, Mr. Patterson, and half the neighborhood.
The young man who had once judged customers by their appearance was now authorized to respond to medical emergencies and save lives, a transformation that still amazed everyone who had witnessed his journey. The ceremony was part of a larger community appreciation event organized by the VFW Post, which I had joined shortly after that pivotal morning at the gas station. Mr. Patterson had been right about the service never really ending. It had simply evolved into something quieter but equally meaningful. Our post now coordinated disaster preparedness training, supported local first responders, and mentored young people interested in careers in public service. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, beaming with pride, as if Brad were her own grandson. The rebuilding of her house had been completed ahead of schedule, largely because the community had rallied around the project with volunteer labor and donated materials. Whiskers had supervised much of the construction from his favorite perch in the new sunroom, apparently none the worse for his adventure in the smoky basement. Sophia, my niece, who had extended her spring break visit into a summer internship with the local Environmental Protection Agency, was documenting the event for a college project about community resilience. She had interviewed everyone involved in what she called the gas station transformation story, fascinated by how a single conversation could ripple outward to create positive change in so many lives. "Aunt Maria," she had said during one of our evening walks around the neighborhood, "your story proves that real leadership isn't about commanding people. It's about helping them discover what they're capable of becoming." The observation had stuck with me because it captured something essential about the difference between military leadership and civilian influence. In the Army, I had been responsible for mission success and troop welfare within clearly defined hierarchical structures. In civilian life, leadership was more subtle, based on inspiration and example rather than rank and authority. As Brad walked across the stage to receive his certification, I caught his eye and gave him an encouraging nod. He had thrown himself into the EMT training with the same intensity he had once applied to his prejudices, studying late into the night and volunteering for extra practical sessions. His instructors had praised his natural empathy and his ability to remain calm under pressure, qualities that had emerged once he stopped using his energy to judge others and started using it to help them. Frank had closed the gas station early so he could attend the ceremony, something he had never done in 15 years of running the business. His pride in Brad's achievement was obvious to everyone present, and he had already promised to hire 2 part-time employees so Brad could maintain his EMT schedule while keeping his job at the station. After the formal ceremony concluded, people gathered in the community center's main hall for refreshments and informal conversation. I found myself surrounded by neighbors and fellow veterans, all wanting to share stories about community service and the importance of supporting young people who chose careers in public safety. Mr. Patterson appeared at my elbow, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose faith in human nature had been validated. "Colonel," he said, offering me one of the cups, "I wanted you to know that Brad asked to be assigned to our post's youth mentorship program. He wants to share his story with teenagers who might be struggling with similar issues about respect and assumptions." "That's wonderful," I said, though I wasn't entirely surprised. Brad's transformation had been thorough and genuine, the kind of change that created a desire to help others avoid the mistakes he had made. He also asked specifically to work with young people from diverse backgrounds, Mr. Patterson continued, because he said he understands firsthand how dangerous it can be when people make judgments based on limited information. Mrs. Chen joined our conversation, still glowing with happiness from the evening's events. "Maria, I wanted to thank you again for encouraging Brad during his training. He told me that your belief in his potential made all the difference during the difficult phases of the program." "Brad did all the hard work himself," I replied, though I was touched by the acknowledgement. I just reminded him that people are capable of growth when they're willing to put in the effort. Sophia appeared beside us, her notebook filled with observations and quotes from the people she had interviewed throughout the evening. "Aunt Maria, I think I finally understand what you meant when you said that military training teaches you to see opportunities for service everywhere." "What do you mean?" "Well, most people would have seen Brad's behavior at the gas station as just rudeness to be ignored or reported. But you saw it as an opportunity to plant seeds of change that could grow into something positive for the whole community."
Her insight was more sophisticated than I had expected, reflecting the kind of deep thinking about leadership and social responsibility that gave me hope for her generation. As the evening wound down and people began to head home, Brad approached me with a serious expression that I had learned to recognize as his thoughtful mode rather than his defensive one. "Colonel Santos," he said, "I wanted to give you something." He handed me a small wrapped package, and when I opened it, I found a pocket-sized emergency medical reference guide with an inscription on the inside cover. "To Colonel Santos, who taught me that helping people is the best use of training and knowledge. Thank you for seeing who I could become. Brad Martinez, EMT." I felt my throat tighten with emotion as I read the inscription, struck by the coincidence that both Brad and Officer Martinez shared the same last name, and more importantly, by the evidence of how completely Brad had internalized the lessons about service and responsibility. "Thank you, Brad," I said, meaning it more than he could know. "I hope I can live up to the example you said," he said earnestly. "Not just the dramatic stuff like rescuing cats from burning buildings, but the everyday kindness and respect that makes community stronger." As I drove home that night, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with a routine stop for gasoline and evolved into something that had changed multiple lives in ways none of us could have predicted. The small photograph from Mrs. Chen sat in a place of honor on my mantelpiece, alongside Brad's EMT reference guide and a letter from Sophia's college professor praising her project about community transformation. The gas station had become more than just a place to buy fuel. It had become a symbol of how ordinary interactions could create extraordinary opportunities for growth and connection. Frank had started displaying community service information on a bulletin board near the cash register, and customers often lingered to discuss local volunteer opportunities and upcoming events. My phone buzzed with a text message from Miguel. "Saw the photos Sophia posted from tonight's ceremony. Proud of you, Hermana, for finding your place in the civilian world." I smiled as I typed back. Turns out the civilian world needed what the military taught me, just in different ways. His response came quickly. "That's what Dad always said. Service is service, whether you're wearing a uniform or not." As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed that Mrs. Chen had left her porch light on, a small gesture that had become our informal signal that Whiskers was safely inside and all was well with the world. The simple routine reminded me that community was built through countless small acts of consideration and care, the daily choices to look out for each other that created the foundation for more dramatic acts of heroism when they were needed. 6 months ago, I had been a retired Army officer trying to figure out how to be a civilian. Tonight, I was a neighbor, a mentor, a community leader, and a friend to people whose lives had become intertwined with mine through the simple act of choosing conversation over confrontation and growth over judgment. The transformation had been gradual and sometimes challenging, but it had led to exactly the kind of life I had hoped to build when I decided to settle in this quiet neighborhood. A life where service continued in new forms, where relationships mattered more than recognition, and where the training I had received in one context could be applied to create positive change in another. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.